All right. Do you see all that? You see that? Okay. So I'm mostly going to talk about my book projects and how they figure into understanding what's happening in contemporary Northwest China today. Um, I've written a few books, and Christy just mentioned some of them. Terror Capitalism is the more academic book that's based on my dissertation research when I was getting my PhD in anthropology at UW. It's based on field work that I did in the capital city of Xinjiang, the Uyghur Autonomous Region, between 2010 and 2018. And what I argue in this book is that what's being built in Northwest China, a system of surveillance and mass internment and coerced labor, is a new sequence in racialized surveillance capitalism. And so this is kind of an academic text, and I'm thinking in dialogue with scholarship on racial capitalism and also on surveillance capitalism. I don't know if you've come across that kind of work in your teaching, but surveillance capitalism is something that the scholar Shoshana Zuboff, who's a business professor from the Harvard Business School, wrote about what Facebook and Twitter and the other social media platforms in North America are doing to us when they are surveilling our social behavior and using that to build prediction products, target us with ads and all of that. And she talks about this as a kind of a new frontier of economic development, economic accumulation, capital accumulation. I'm saying that something similar is happening in Northwest China, but it's instead of producing a consumer base, it's producing sort of workers within a smart factory system. And it's also harvesting the data of the Uyghur population. So Uyghurs become a kind of laboratory space for developing new kinds of economic benefits. The book is structured in a way that it talks about the system being built and then how it's being refused as sort of a call and response. And so as the system is being built, what it's doing is it's subtracting or taking away the ability of Uyghurs to produce their own future as a society by enclosing them with walls, but mostly through the digital enclosure, by devaluing their culture and society and their knowledge, and by dispossessing them of their land and their labor. The second half of the book is focused on how those systems of enclosure, devaluation, and dispossession are refused by Uyghurs even as they're being built. And so I talk about how Uyghur young men, which was the main group of people I spent time with, use their friendships and forms of storytelling to care for each other, even as they were sort of on the run from the police, they were being detained. I also talk about how Han people in the city, some of them, tried to protect Uyghur people by building forms of friendship with Uyghurs, ways of advocating for them as they could. And I also talk about how Uyghurs continue to exist, how they find ways to make do and to stay alive, even as their future is so tightly constrained. And one of the ways that I talk about that in the book is by talking about how I co-translated a novel, The Backstreets, with one of these young migrant men, and how that book became a sort of springboard for thinking about what migrant life is like in the city, how to tell stories about that life. What's missing in the novel is the author, the protagonist is completely alone. He has no friends. And so a lot of the Uyghur young men I spoke to about the novel or read the novel with me would remark on those sorts of things. So I'm telling you about both of these books in case you're a literature professor or teacher and want to think about Uyghur literature in translation. This is a text I think that a high school student could really engage with. It's sort of a Kafka-esque story of migrant life in the city, set in contemporary Northwest China. But really, it's the author is very influenced by Camus and Franz Kafka and other contemporary or modernist writers, and so it's kind of in that vein. The other book that I wrote, and this maybe is the book that might be more useful in the classroom, is In the Camps, China's High-Tech Penal Colony. And this is a book that is set after the Terror Capitalism book and what comes next, which is the mass internment system, and is based on interviews I did with former detainees, including one who was a University of Washington student who was detained in 2017 or 2018. She was detained in end of 2017 and then released in 2018. These people are mostly Kazakhs who were able to flee across the border to Kazakhstan after their detention, usually because they had been detained sort of by accident or without the authorities knowing that they were actually Kazakhstani citizens. And so the Kazakhstani government petitioned for their release, which was why they were able to leave. I went to Kazakhstan in 2020, right before the pandemic, and spent a good deal of time in that community, not only with the former detainees, but also with the family members of detainees, people who had also fled across the border and could tell me about what the system was like outside of the camp system. It's also based in some ways on interviews I did with camp workers or low-level surveillance workers. Some of those are people that have fled the country. Others were those that I interviewed in 2018, which was the last time I visited, and who could tell me some of the things about what they thought they were doing as they were building this mass internment system, how they thought it would be a benefit for Uyghurs to be detained and re-educated in these camps. I also draw quite a lot on internal police files, which were obtained by a journal called The Intercept. This is a journal that was started by Jeremy Scahill and Glenn Greenwald, although he's now no longer works at that journal. Sort of in the vein of WikiLeaks or the Snowden revelations. They were able to obtain hundreds of thousands of internal files from one of the state contractors in Xinjiang. And so we have all of these really detailed reports of what the system could do, how many people were detained, why they were detained, all of this information from the low-level police and citizens in that space from 2017 to 2019. And so it helps us to give me some confidence in making the claims that I make in the book based on the interviews with these former detainees, that what they are saying is actually quite true based on the internal files that I've seen. Of course, I've also looked at lots of government and industry documents that speak to these issues as well. This book is written sort of in the style of a narrative nonfiction essay. It's part of the Columbia Journalism School's Columbia Global Reports series. And it's edited by Nicholas Lemon, who's the staff writer for the New Yorker. So it's really in the style of the New Yorker. It's quite accessible, I hope. I know it's being taught in high schools. I know this because my nephew was taught it in his class. And so he interviewed the author for one of his reports. The author being me. There's also another companion book that you can access as well that's open source, open access, called Xinjiang Year Zero, which is also, I think, a good text for high school students. You can just download chapters. This is from Australia National University Press and includes some of my writing, but writing of other scholars who are looking at the region. So the story of what's happened in Northwest China, that is featured in all of these books, is a story of Han migration to the Uyghur region that began really in the 1990s. There had been migration prior to this, but in the 1990s, China was opening up to the West, was becoming a manufacturer for the world, and needed access to raw materials. And the Uyghur region is the source of around 20% of China's oil and natural gas, even higher proportion of Chinese coal, and has since become the source of around 86% of China's cotton, which is around 20% of the world's supply. And I know from a friend who was recently visiting textile manufacturers in Eastern China that what he was finding out was that it's almost impossible to find textiles, especially those that have any sort of cotton in them, that aren't exposed, that aren't coming from Xinjiang, just because it's such an important part of the Chinese textile industry. And I'll get into this later on in the talk, but this cotton related manufacturing is very closely associated with the camp and forced labor system in Northwest China. But getting back to the story of the 1990s, as those settlers arrived, the Han people, which is a majority group in China, they began to build the hard infrastructure to extract the resources, the pipelines and roads. And over time, they started to really take over the institutions of this space. Prior to their arrival, over 90% of the population in the southern part of the region were Uyghur. But by to the 2000s, most institutions, the banking system, the education system, government system, were all now dominated by the settler population. So Uyghurs saw themselves being dispossessed of their own land through that process, and they saw themselves entering into a relationship of domination in which nearly all aspects of life were now controlled by the settler population. So really what they were experiencing was a repetition of an older story of colonialism. This is an internal settler colony of China that, in some ways is similar to the way Alaska is positioned relative to the United States. It's a resource colony for the nation. Part of what the settlers brought with them was digital infrastructure as well. So as I was starting my fieldwork in 2011, I saw all these young men beginning to buy smartphones for the first time and using the digital networks, 3G networks, to access the internet. And when they discovered the internet, much of the internet had already been controlled by the Chinese state, in the sense that Twitter and Facebook, all of those social media platforms that we use, were blocked in China. And so Uyghurs were pushed towards another platform called WeChat, which is a super app that includes a lot of the functionality of WhatsApp, but also is now a payment platform. It's a source of much of life activities across China. And for Uyghurs, it was a game changer because it allowed them to use oral speech to send voice memos to each other, which was important because Uyghurs, many of them were not able to type in Chinese characters, and the keyboards on the phones didn't accept Uyghur Arabic script. So they could speak and connect with each other quite easily. The app was very accessible, so even if they didn't have a lot of computer literacy, they could use it really easily. And over time, they quickly became connected with each other, with Uyghurs living in diaspora, with the broader Muslim community. And so it opened up Uyghur society to the world in a way that it never had been before. But in a way that was sort of autonomous, because Uyghurs were circumventing a lot of the censorship of the state because of the way that they were using their language, and the state just couldn't tell what people were saying in Uyghur. The app also connected Uyghurs with the city in ways that they hadn't been before, because people from their village would go to the city and then they'd post images and text or send messages home about what was going on in the city. And because of all of the dispossession that was happening with all of the settlers moving into the south and the cost of living really starting to rise and Uyghurs being excluded from the resource sector, many of them, especially young Uyghurs, began to migrate to the city. And that's where I found them, was in the city, looking for work, but also looking for more freedom, more autonomy. As they said, in the village, everyone knows everybody. And so if you go to the mosque, or if you're practicing Islam too regularly, people will pay attention. The government will notice. In the city, there's a lot more anonymity, and so we can connect with each other and go to the mosque. Of course, the mosque in Urumqi was also surveilled. There's cameras that you can see maybe here and definitely inside. And there's a fence that's preventing people from going inside as well, without showing their ID. But it's a space for the ritual practice of Islam. Uyghurs said, though, that real Islam was happening on their phones, was happening on SD cards, where they were sharing oral teachings and textual teachings. They're sharing files using an application called Kwaya, which on an Android phone is like AirDrop and allows you to send files without even accessing the internet. And so, most of the teachings that they were sharing were from Uyghurs in the region who were Islamic teachers who weren't authorized by the state. And in some cases, they were teachers based in Egypt, in Turkey, in Uzbekistan, and were part of sort of global piety networks. And so what we were seeing among young Uyghurs was a turn towards more pious forms of Islamic practice, which is common in many places in the world. Men starting to grow beards, women veiling themselves in more pious ways. Although historically Uyghurs have, especially rural Uyghurs, have dressed in these kinds of ways. So it's not an entirely new thing. But the state saw this as a turn towards extremism. And so I was interviewing these low-level police that said, like, the Uyghurs are becoming like the Taliban. They're becoming dangerous. They're being infected by what they would call foreign Islam. And there was also a history since 2001 when China began to talk about Uyghur protest over land dispossession and police brutality as a kind of terrorism. And so the discourse of terrorism really began to take an uptick, and they began to conflate Islamic practice with political violence. Much of the violence, as I just mentioned already, was related to injustice that Uyghurs experienced in their lives. But there was several incidents in 2013 and 14 when Uyghurs did attack Han civilians, and in premeditated ways, in ways that met sort of international definitions of what constitutes terrorism. These are, a handful of people carrying out these kinds of violent crimes. But in response, the state declared what they called the People's War on Terror. And they began to post these posters in the neighborhoods where I was living, saying it's now illegal for women to veil themselves, men to have beards, or to have Islamic symbols on their clothing. They began this mass de-extremification campaign. Initially, they mostly targeted the religious leaders, people that had been sharing, posting messages on social media and stuff, sending them to these new schools that they called re-education schools. That were mostly party training centers. There were several thousand people that were taken around that time. We thought, my friends, people I was interviewing, thought that would be the extent of it, and that, this is just another sort of wave of oppression, a wave of state control, not necessarily something that would turn into a mass internment system. But we didn't know at the time that the state was mobilizing, as part of this counterterrorism effort, a digital surveillance system, something that was built around the idea of counterinsurgency, which means that you should have full spectrum intelligence of the population, and then you should be able to sort of sort the insurgents from the normal people and the counterinsurgents. This is what the Petraeus Doctrine in Iraq said that you should do when the US was conducting a war in Iraq. That's now like military science everywhere in the world. This is how warfare is conducted, and the Chinese are doing the same. But they're also doing something more than that, something that's more along the lines of preventative policing, which is also something used everywhere in the world when it comes to policing now, which is about sort of detecting potential criminality before it happens. The difference being, in China, pre-crime can result in detention, whereas in other cases it just means that the person would be put on a watch list. In order to enact this system, the state worked with private industry to build the system. So there's this huge upsurge in private-public partnerships, over $1 trillion in contracts. And then they also began this unprecedented hiring of low-level police, people that they refer to as police assistants, and also regular police, which meant that eventually Xinjiang, the Uyghur region, had a policing density that was really analogous to East Germany before the fall of the Berlin Wall. One of the most tightly policed places in the world. The initial goal of this system, which I refer to in the shorter book, both books, as a digital enclosure, was to break the autonomy of the Uyghur internet, to stop them from using Uyghur language in a free way. But it became over time a kind of digital enclosure system, a sort of flexible enclosure system that used checkpoints nested for a nested series of checkpoints across the entire region to prevent movement and to assess movement in the past, in the present, in the future. There's 1,400 tech firms working in the region, which is has made it sort of an incubator for tech development. $100 billion, more than that, more than 100 billion, were invested in infrastructure, around 10 to 20 in high-tech infrastructure. What we see in the scholarship around this is that an economist at Harvard has written a really great article on this, that there's a direct transfer of from state applications. So when these companies are working for the state as state contractors, they get access to state data, which means that they have access to 1.4 billion personal files of everyone in the country, and in particular the high resolution imagery that they're getting in Xinjiang. And once they have access to that data, within 2 years, the face recognition startups begin to build commercial applications. And so from the company's perspective, it's really lucrative to both get those contracts from the state, but more importantly, to get access to the data, because that allows them to develop new tools. And also it keeps them within the good graces of the state. And so the state will give them other contracts in other places and other sectors of the economy. And so these companies are working with in smartphone applications to do the face unlock that an iPhone can do. So that's one of the application, but then at the same time they're building face recognition systems in Xinjiang to automate the detection of Uyghur faces, to racialize populations. So they're working in multiple sectors at once. One of the companies working in this region, iFlyTech, first focused on the auto transcription, translation, and assessment of Uyghur speech, but now has dozens of languages that it's able to do this kind of work around. And I know here in Canada, you can still buy lots of iFlyTech applications on Amazon, like little devices that you can take with you when you travel. And so if you don't speak French when you're in France, you have them speak in a device and it'll automate translation for you. That's the kind of tools that iFlyTech is pioneering, voice recognition tools. The system to automate the detection of Uyghur faces and Kazakh faces was something that is now standard in face recognition companies across the country. It's one of the first state-sponsored projects to automate racial profiling. But of course, the technology wasn't the only thing that was put in place here. The police were a really important part of this project, because the technology can only detect so much. And so, they also implemented sort of face-to-face evaluations of people, asking them about these 10 different categories. And so everyone had this population data form that they needed to fill out. This is one of the ways in which that form was assessed. So each person would start with 100 points, and each category that counted against them they would be deducted 10 points. And based on their scoring, they would move to trustworthy or normal or untrustworthy. Some of these questions were just basic sort of existence kinds of questions, like what is the age of the person? What's their ethnicity? Are they underemployed or unemployed? And many Uyghurs fit into those categories. And so they move very quickly from the trustworthy category to the normal category. Other questions had to do with their religious practice, 5, 6, and 10. Did they pray daily? Did they have religious knowledge? Which meant had they studied Arabic? Had they learned to read the Quran, which was among the Uyghurs I was interviewing, very common. Almost everyone I knew had done that when they were a child, even though it was, technically illegal. They had gone to like a friend, a neighbor friend as a group of boys on Saturday, kind of against their will, and they had learned to read some of the surahs in the Quran, something that their parents, wanted them to do so that they would be educated, respectable people. There was also questions about travel. They gone to one of 26 banned countries, which were Muslim majority countries, overstayed a visa. Did they have a relative living abroad? All of these categories were things that were quite common, were not illegal things, but over time became part of how the state decided who should be detained. People knew what the right answers were here too as well. So people would, not say yes to things that they thought the state couldn't prove, which meant that they had to turn again to the technology to do more assessment. One of the things that they began to do in 2016 and 17 was build over 9,000 people's convenience police stations with their surveillance hubs every 200 or 300 meters in Uyghur majority areas. We began to track people's behavior. And then these low-level police that were based at these stations began to do spot checks using devices such as this one, which is really based on Israeli technology from a company called Celebrite, which is the world's largest digital forensics company. Celebrite had been working in China up until quite recently. And these Chinese companies have developed the same kinds of tools. They're tools that are able to crack the codes of phones. That's what they are trying to do. But then they also do more than that. They automate searches of people's digital history. So they can see if someone, for instance, has downloaded one of those file sharing apps or used a VPN or used WhatsApp, all banned apps in Xinjiang now. And based on that assessment, they would get a reading of the person. So one of the low-level police I interviewed said that many of the times when they got a red code, which meant untrustworthy, immediate detention, was that this person had listened to unauthorized religious teachings. There was evidence of that. They had been part of a religious study group on WeChat. They had used a VPN at WhatsApp or had just Muslim-related materials on their phone. One of the internal documents that was recovered by some investigative journalists shows that over 1.8 million people in Xinjiang were found to have illegal apps on their phones through these searches. It's not to say that all 1.8 million people were detained. They may have decided that some of them didn't need to be detained, but many of them were. And between 2017 and 2018, between 900 and 1.5 million people were detained and sent to what they were referred to as closed concentrated education and training centers, which you see pictured here. These in the state's sort of rhetoric are talked about as vocational training schools, but when you look at them on the ground, you realize that these have electric fencing, razor wire, watchtowers. When you get a little closer, you see that they have full spectrum intelligence within them, in the sense that they have cameras everywhere, even inside the cells where people are held, in the classrooms. These are really sort of medium to maximum security prison facilities. And this is the largest camp facility that we've found. It's close to Urumqi, and the police documents that I have, which are also from Urumqi, in those documents, I see hundreds of mentions of people being sent to this camp in particular. In 2018, another leaked document, this is government drone footage of a prisoner or detainee transfer, was revealed, showing that people or have their hands shackled, they have masks over their eyes. It says on the back of their vests where they're coming from in Kashgar, and then we've geolocated this image, this video, to be in Korla, which is hundreds of kilometers away from where they are sent. And around the same time, the Xinjiang Development Ministry said that they are that the camp system, these closed concentrated education training centers, have become a carrier of the economy because they're attracting so many manufacturers from Eastern China, you know, who are using the labor of the people that have been sent to these camps. And so this prisoner transfer, detainee transfer is part of that process. It's about moving people into the places where they need to be in order to work, or at least that is the most likely explanation for the transfer. Also, there's a severe overcrowding in many of these facilities. We know from talking to the detainees. Very quickly, we start to see factory complexes emerge adjacent to the camp systems, or sometimes within them. We sometimes see the camps themselves become factories. Initially, the first people sent to the factories were women from the camp system. Mostly they were sent into low skill work, a lot of it textile work, which, you know, Xinjiang is the source of Chinese cotton, so it makes a great deal of sense that these would be the people that are sent. One of the women who was detained in one of these camps and then sent to work in a factory was this woman, Gulzira Al-Khan, who I interviewed in 2020. She was found guilty of watching Turkish TV shows, of traveling to Kazakhstan, having a passport, being under the age of 55, having WhatsApp on her phone. And for all those reasons was held in a camp for a year under really horrific conditions. And then sent back to her village for several days. And then the local official said, now you're going to go work in this factory, which was around 7 kilometers from the camp that she had been held previous. And when she arrived in the factory, she recognized her new boss, which was this guy, Wang Xinghua, because she had seen him in the camp. He had come through the camp several times and had selected detainees to work in the factory. And I'm pointing that out because it's important to see just how close the mechanism is between the camp system and the factory system. That the factory owners and managers understand very clearly where these workers are coming from, and that they're very complicit in the system. Gulzira was told that if she didn't work as she was told, she would be sent back to the camp. So there's this sort of coercion that's held over the workers. Here, Wang Xinghua is talking to state TV about the success of the factory, saying it's created around 2,000 jobs for Uyghurs and Kazakhs. It's part of a poverty alleviation program and a job training program. He also says that it's generated $6 million in sales. What he doesn't say is that what Gulzira and one of her coworkers, who is also now in Kazakhstan and could speak to this independently of Gulzira, is that they were paid only around 300 yuan, or $50 per month, and then a piece rate of 1.5 pennies per pair of gloves that they were able to sew in this factory. And so they're paying them around 1/6 of the minimum wage. It's way below standard wages, and really just enough to sort of buy some things at the camp factory commissary, not enough to live. It really, didn't provide any sort of sustenance for them. And ways that they Wang Xinghua and others told Gulzira the reason for this was that their salary needed to be deducted because of the housing and food costs, and also because they provided transportation. Gulzira, who's now in Kazakhstan, told me there were checkpoints at the entrance of the walled-off dormitory and factory where her ID and face were scanned. She said we would have our bodies and phones checked when we arrived and in the middle of the day. When we were leaving for the dormitory at the end of the day, they would check again because they were worried we might take a sewing needle. After we got to know the police contractors, we asked them, why are you still here watching us? They just laughed, never replied. The answer to this question was that the security workers were monitoring whether or not they were acting like submissive, re-educated industrial workers. Another former re-educated worker named Rebecca told me, we just had to smile and say, yes, yes. We were like pets. So what Gozira and Rebecca are describing is a system of unfreedom, something that in one of my articles I refer to as a re-education labor regime that exists sort of between prison labor and factory work. It's a smart camp or smart workhouse system where it's not fully part of the carceral system, but it's also not part of the free wage market. This is a system of immense cruelty, really, because it's producing forms of dislocation, removal from community, and from family. Family separation is endemic throughout all of this society. In some cases, the factories and the prisons are very, very close to each other, or the camps. This is in Hotan, where you see the high security area here, and then right behind it is the shoe factories, where they're turning Hotan into sort of a center of shoe production on the New Silk Road. The checkpoints that exist within the factory systems, or as you move through space in those compounds, but also as you move through space everywhere. So I went through a lot of these checkpoints too when I was there in 2018. They look like this, and they're basically border crossings. So what you need to do is you need to put your state issued ID here, and then it will scan your face and match the image on your ID to your face, which is something similar to what we do when we travel internationally these days, is the TSA or border control. They are also scanning our faces now here in the US, or when I go to the US. This system was built by CETC, which is China's Electronic Technology Corporation, which is a parent company for Hikvision, which is the world's largest camera manufacturer. And is an immense system that pulls together lots and lots of different forms of data, making people searchable in real time. One of the things that is worth noting is that these data doors, which is what these are not metal detectors, or not only metal detectors, they're also making sure that the person's phone is registered to the ID that was just scanned. So it's another sort of hard set in the system to know a data point where that person was in time and space. Since 2019, the governor of the region has said all the trainees have graduated. But what a colleague of mine, a friend called Dave Kong, who's an investigative reporter for Associated Press, has found when he visited more recently is that this camp, at this camp, the nameplate, that said what this place was as you were entering has simply been changed from the concentrated closed education training center to a detention center, which means that it's now become part of the formal prison system. And he interviewed a former worker who said, all of the former students inside have simply become prisoners. And so that's one of the shifts that we've seen in the system. As China has realized that the international community is appalled by a mass internment camp system, they've sort of switched towards a more formal incarceration system. So what we've seen since 2017 is 614,000 people have been formally prosecuted in the region, which is a dramatic increase from previous rates. It's more than 6 times the national average. It sort of depends on how you look at it. If you think about this prosecution as mostly Muslim men, and then take a proportion of the Muslim male population, it's more like 20 times the national average. The other track, of course, is the factory system. So some of these camps have now been renamed as factories. Some camps have also been abandoned. But in general, the system of closed concentrated education and training centers no longer exists, at least in the form that it was in prior to the end of 2019. One other track of the system is the track that doesn't include detainees, but it is rather farmers. They're mostly the relatives of detainees who are sent to work in factories in the region. So most of them are actually in the region, but then others are sent to work in factories outside of the region. And these are some images from a state video where they're talking about this, another form of poverty alleviation. These are assigned workers from northern Xinjiang who are sent to a factory in eastern China, a technology company. At night, they're learning about party ideology. They are accompanied by a police officer who's managing them and protecting the management of the factory, Akbel, from the workers. And also by a Communist Party member who I think acts mostly as translator, because many of these workers don't speak Chinese yet, although they are learning Chinese in the factory. Akbel is an interesting, just as a sort of a side note, Akbel at the time when this video was made was part of the Apple supply chain. So they were making component parts for Apple, at least some of their factories. And Apple has now said they no longer work with this company. Back in Xinjiang, the system continues in much the same way as it did before, with the sort of renaming of the camps as prisons or factories. But the digital enclosure system is ongoing. It means that people can be they can be found in real time. So you can type in the person's name or their ID number into the interface that is available to hundreds of thousands of state workers, and you can find where they are, or very close to where they are. And then you can also look at where they were yesterday and the day before that. You can set the parameters of the system so that you're assessing people, patterns of movement in people's behavior, or where they're allowed to travel. So it's all of this is making people searchable in real time. And so there's one other system in the world that's similar to this, and that's what the Israelis are using in relation to Palestinians, something called Wolf Pack, which allows Palestinians to be tracked in real time as well. A lot of this tracking is based on the checkpoints in the Xinjiang case, but also with face recognition systems that are tracking people's movement as they move through space. The system itself is very extensive. This is the geolocated spaces where we have police reports from the city of Urumqi, built by a company from Shanghai called Landasoft, using Oracle software, which Oracle, of course, is a US company. And what the system is producing is a sort of this flexible enclosure system, which allows Han people, which is a majority group, again, the settler group, to sort of live and function in the city without any of the inconvenience of control. So there's all of these green lanes where people can walk through. One of a student I interviewed who went back to visit her relatives, and then when she came back to the US was sort of shocked by what she had seen. She told me that her relatives also complained about the checkpoints. For instance, at first, when the campaign began, everyone who was riding a public bus to the city had to wait while the Uyghurs were checked. After several months, though, it got better. That's what her mom told her, because the buses just started to leave the Uyghurs behind in the checkpoint while the bus continued on to the city. So what I saw in 2018 verified or supported that this framing of how the system works. Han people can simply walk through the checkpoints without any sort of stop. Uyghurs, on the other hand, are stopped on a very at quite a high regularity. And so what the system does is it sort of indexes the loyal, protected citizen. It gives them a sense of their power and their privilege, that they are able to move through this system without having to stop. And it sort of emphasizes or naturalizes the idea that Uyghurs are criminals and need to be evaluated. The system gives people a sense of pride as well, that like their country is really protecting them and that it's using cutting edge technology to do so. Some of that pride, though, I think is being pushed, or it's being punctured by the ways in which similar kinds of technology were used to prevent people's movement during the COVID quarantines across the country. And so I think what I'm seeing among a younger generation of Chinese peoples, especially international students, is a real antipathy towards the way that the Chinese state is using this kind of surveillance. And there's a growing support really for Uyghurs, because they realize now that what was done in their name is very real, and is a system of almost total control. Another scholar who I collaborate with and think with is Shoshana Ghosh, who's looking at similar kinds of systems that are being built in India to target Muslim people there. And what she notes is that it produces a kind of subordinated inclusion. So people they know where everyone is, and they're including them in the society, but in a very subordinated way. So what does this case suggest? Well, what's being produced here is an enclosure of life, which is part of the way that economies are built in general. It's how a capital is accumulated by bringing things that are outside of the economy into it. So, traditionally that was natural gas, that was oil, natural resources, and then it was agricultural based stuff. So turning land that was held in common into farmland that was privately owned, which has the effect of pushing people off of the land and into the factories. That's how capitalism got its start. It's continuing, though, to find new frontiers, to find ways of pushing people that are in subordinated or powerless positions into productive roles, but unpaid or devalued roles within the economy. And so the argument of my work is that this is what's happening in Northwest China. It's not only happening in Northwest China, but this is one site where it's maybe a limit case, which means like a worst case scenario of how this could play out and is playing out. Surveillance is an essential part of the process. Without surveillance, colonialism can't happen. Without surveillance, new forms of economic enclosure or material and digital enclosure cannot be enforced. And so you see similar kinds of systems happening in the US, in South Africa, and Israel to different effects and at different historical moments. But it's, I think, part of the same sort of system. And we can talk more about that in the Q&A if you like. What's happening in Northwest China is unique in some ways in the sense that it's a colonial system. It's a system that is there to support the settler population's power, their ability to possess Uyghur land and not worry that Uyghurs will demand it back. It's also part of a process of dispossessing Uyghurs of their life and their epistemology, or their knowledge system. Because once all of life is turned into data, which is what the state is trying to do with all of the digital surveillance, it means that Uyghurs cannot really bring their history into the present. They just can't talk about Uyghur history. They can't talk about religion. They can't practice religion. All of that is possessed now through the data system. It's also building forms of domination in the way that it's capturing the institutions of the Uyghurs, institutions such as the banking system, the religious system, and so on, but even more fundamentally, the language system, the faith practices, even the family itself, and of course, Uyghur attachment to land. All of those things are being attacked. It's making sure that the occupation sticks, that the settlers don't leave, that they feel comfortable and safe living in a Uyghur majority space, because they are still the minority in many of the spaces in Xinjiang, but they feel very protected because of all of the technology and the policing that supports them. Digital technology adds a third or fourth element to the three definitional elements of settler colonialism, because it makes those other three elements, it accelerates them, it intensifies them in ways that are unprecedented, makes these systems automated and scalable in more intimate and banal ways. So in the past, like, the colonizer knew a lot about about what the colonized thought and did. But there was usually some spaces outside of that gaze, like in the person's home, in their immediate community. That now is that space of sort of protection or sanctuary is being punctured. And it's also turning people into sort of objects. Like they really can't perform their discipline. They can't show that they're going to be good citizens. They're already always determined in advance to be terrorists, to be this dangerous other. And it's hard to see, how you can change the system, because the system has its own logic and it has all of this technology that's very hard to reverse. So that's on not a hopeful note, how the system is existing in Northwest China. I don't really see an end, a way of changing the system. There are, of course, things we can do, and I, speak to lawmakers about this. That we can extract ourselves from the supply chains. We can prevent the sale of these kinds of technologies. But those are sort of punitive measures, not really measures that like make life better for Uyghurs. And so another thing that I talk to policy folks about, and also I've given a version of this talk at Google, at machine learning conferences, is that we need to rethink what surveillance is, what kind of surveillance we want. We need to have regulation around surveillance. We need to build technology that liberates and protects vulnerable people rather than makes them susceptible to greater harm. But of course, that's how you do that is very hard to see. It's an immense system and world, and there's a lot of money and power that stand in opposition to what I just said we should do.